Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers. Because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD and working on a product to help people overcome these problems because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you.
Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast, now part of the Finding Genius Foundation. My guest today is Dr. Alan Bauman, MD. He's a leading expert in hair transplant surgery and hair loss treatment. He's been doing this for over 28 years. He leads Bauman Medical, a globally respected practice that is dedicated to restoring confidence and self-esteem through cutting-edge hair restoration procedures. And he's based out of Boca Raton, Florida. So welcome, Alan. Thanks for coming. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Richard. Great to be here with you.
Yeah, what got you into hair? Why not other parts of the body or other conditions?
Well, as they say, you're not born into being a hair transplant surgeon. So my story is pretty unique. I guess if you clock all the way back to before my interest in medicine, if you asked my grandmother when she was alive, when did Alan become interested in becoming a physician or a doctor, she probably would have said something like the day he was born. So it was a little bit preordained that I was, on my path towards medical school, I guess. And it was probably a good thing that I was okay in biology and chemistry and math and all of that business. My dad's a dentist. My uncle's a gastroenterologist. My grandfather's a PhD in chemistry. And so somewhere around there, and my mom is actually a teacher and an artist, an oil painter. So somewhere around there, I got some interest in going into medicine. And later on in my early childhood, actually, before I could drive a car, I was actually mentored by a plastic surgeon from New York. And he introduced me to surgery. And so just, for those folks out there who maybe were not around in the 80s, there was no Snapchat, there was no Discovery Channel, there was no YouTube. And so if you wanted to go see surgery, you actually had to go and, physically see the surgery. And that's what I had an opportunity to do before I could drive a car, actually. So I was able to watch plastic surgery, cosmetic and reconstructive surgery through a friend of the family who introduced me to that end of medicine. And getting to know his patients and his techniques, I really became interested in cosmetic and reconstructive surgery and kind of followed that as a path. My undergraduate medical school, even my internship and residency was in surgery, always thinking that I was going to be a plastic surgeon. And it wasn't until I met a hair transplant patient, actually, did I even think that hair transplant was a viable thing. I guess like most people, I thought hair transplants were pluggy and painful and, didn't look right. And like, why would you ever do that? And this patient's experience and actual evidence on his scalp was to the contrary, that it looked beautiful and natural. And I was just fascinated by that.
It's funny that you say that because to me, plastic surgery, it looks like they mess it up all the time. I mean, you see these stars that you think are paying like crazy amounts of money for the best in the world, and they look horrible, like monsters. Like to me, hair stuff, I think, again, not knowing, but hair seems like it works well, and plastic surgery seems like it's botched a lot, but that's just my layman perspective.
Well, it all depends on the surgeon. That's the thing. To be honest, our best work goes unnoticed. And so that's what I noticed about this gentleman's hair transplant, that I was expecting to see plugs, you know what I mean? And his results from his procedure in that early stage of the genesis of hair transplants was amazing. And I talked to him about that, and he explained to me how he chose a surgeon and things like that. And then, granted, this was like 30 years ago. And so that kind of started me on my path, thinking to myself, okay, this is a cosmetic and reconstructive thing that has some artistry to it. He had obviously had some single follicle implantation, so it looked normal and natural. And so I started to look into it. And that's where I really began my journey of investigation first, going to the journal articles and textbooks. And even some of those textbooks were just pretty nasty. I mean, we're talking like the old plug type procedures where it looked like doll's hair, and it didn't comport with what I saw in
I
this
wonder if they
patient.
called it plug and play. That'd be funny.
Maybe. But the old hair plugs, they were pretty nasty looking. But what I saw on this guy really, it encouraged me to dig deeper. And that's where I started to travel around the country and around the world to go to these different conferences, thinking if I could learn the latest and greatest in hair transplant, I could probably add that to a plastic surgery, repertoire, if you will. And I had the unique opportunity to do an externship, really like a preceptorship with a hair transplant surgeon out on Long Island. And I was able to work with him in his practice for a year. And so I took a little hiatus from my training and did that, my general surgery training. And it was at that point I realized, listen, if I'm going to do this, first of all, I loved it. I fell in love with the process, the procedure, the artistry, the technology. And I realized that I had to dedicate full-time effort in order to make it work correctly, make it look good. And that's how I got started. So that was back, in the 1990s. And in 1997, I opened my practice here in Boca Raton, Florida, with a very small office of 1,000 square feet, one operatory. I was engaged to my wife at the time, and I had her answering the phones, and I hired a team of people to help me on the weekends to get things started. And obviously, from those humble beginnings, I've grown it into a practice today that has treated over, 34,000 patients.
That's cool. So now that you've been doing it for a while, what are you helping people to do? Like, what are the reasons they tell you they want hair transplants?
Well, of course, in the world of hair restoration, what we do is not just hair transplant surgery. And of course, that's a big part of the exciting, aspects of my career. But a good percentage of patients that I see day in and day out may never, ever need a hair transplant because we have preventative therapies in the world of hair restoration today. And those might be medications or cell therapy, regenerative treatments, devices like red light, laser light therapy devices and things like that. So it's kind of a combination of things. But I guess what you're asking is like, why do people want to, keep their hair? And, hair is an important part of our self-expression. It's an outward sign of our youth and vitality. You could, make a judgment call from across the room if someone is healthy and young and obviously fertile, which is important in terms of evolution, based on their hair. And I think that's why it was so important to our, maybe our caveman ancestors, so many years ago. And why it remains important to us today as an outward sign of beauty and youth, because when our hair looks good, we feel good. And so being able to restore people's hair after it's been lost is really a blessing for me because I get to change people's lives for the better every day. And that's the exciting part of being in the field of hair restoration, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, what do the patients tell you? What do they complain about that they want to have their hair augmented or restored to before?
Yeah.
Again, in their own words, what do they say to you?
Yeah. Well, patients come in and they say, hey, doc, I've been thinking about my hair for a long time. I know I've got some hair loss in the family, and now I've been seeing the signs in myself. I see the receding hairline very commonly in men, losing coverage in the crown. For women, they'll often say, I'm seeing a lot of shedding, or my ponytail volume is decreasing, or I'm seeing more scalp shining through in my part line. And so what they're asking me is, can we stop the progression of the hair loss? And the answer is yes, obviously we can. And also, can we restore some of the hair that's been lost? And yes, absolutely, we do that as well. So patients want to look better and feel better because, as I mentioned before, hair is an important part of our self-image. When we get up in the morning, we groom ourselves. We usually, for most of us, we look in the mirror and groom ourselves. And hair is a big part of that, whether we just like, running a comb through it or hands through it, maybe thinking about the product or whatever shampoo we're using. But, whether you have long hair or short hair, it becomes part of self-expression. And when a gentleman, for example, is in his younger age years, such as like in their 20s, and they see that hair loss is occurring, it's often a reminder of how they're aging. And, look, 20% of guys in their 20s have hair loss. And, you don't want to be that one guy out of your 5 friends who's out there, in the bar Friday night or whatever, and you're the one dealing with male pattern hair loss looking much older than your stated age. So it can weigh heavily on your, like I said, on your self-image and self-esteem. You look older, feel older, and that's not so good. We want to try to restore that.
Yeah. So are there any shampoos or diets or things that you see that people do that inadvertently contribute to their hair loss?
Well, absolutely. I mean, think about this for a moment. The hair follicle, very highly metabolic organ that's sitting inside the scalp, right? You're born with about 150,000 of them. Each hair follicle has about 100,000 cells, probably over 2 dozen to 3 dozen different types of cells are inside that hair follicle. And that's one of the most highly metabolic cell populations in your body. So it's very, very responsive to your overall health. And what I mean by that is if your hair, let's say your overall health is suffering in some way, either you've gone through a traumatic physiologic event, you're in an accident, you're in the hospital, you have fever, sick, whatever, or if you've gone through a traumatic event mentally, a severe psychological stress. These are things that can affect your hair. If metabolically, nutritionally, you're deficient in, let's just say, protein, you're on a new low protein, vegan vegetarian diet or something like that, that could stress out your hair as well. There's not enough nutrients and fuel to actually fuel those cell populations who are responsible for growing that healthy, smooth, thick head of hair, right? And so overall body inflammation and, your overall wellness, how much sleep you're getting and exposure to toxins and many things like that. So we take a very holistic approach today when it comes to evaluating folks who are dealing with hair loss, looking at all those lifestyle factors, toxins, nutrition, even their sleep and wake cycles and so forth, what medications they might be on and so forth. And you asked specifically about shampoos. I want to know, what is their scalp hygiene regimen look like? And is their scalp, doing okay? Is it healthy? Is it look inflamed? Is it itchy, flaky, oily? Is it red? Is it pimply? These are things that can the average everyday person can understand. If your scalp is not healthy and there's inflammation going on there, you're not going to grow good hair. That's going to interrupt hair follicle function as well. So we do take, to your point of view, a very holistic kind of view of the scalp, making sure the scalp is healthy, as think of it like soil for the plants to grow well. And then that you're providing a great environment, from nutrition and lifestyle factors to be able to grow good hair. So that is all loaded on top of your genetic tendency towards male or female pattern hair loss. The genetic tendency towards hair loss can be quite severe. And as I said, young guys who are in their 20s can often experience some early male pattern hair loss. For women, it can happen due to metabolic imbalance or hormone imbalance of childbearing age, like polycystic ovarian syndrome, or childbirth, where the hormones change. Even menopause, obviously, is another common trigger for female hair loss. So, the hair follicle is a very sensitive organ to hormones and health, for sure.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
Why do people lose their hair? Maybe it's too open a question.
Well, I mean, let's unpack, some of the things that I just said. Of course, there's a genetic tendency. So, you need to look in your family history on their mom's side or the dad's side. Is there hair thinning? What does the hair quality and texture look like? Is there male pattern or female pattern hair loss in the family? Again, mom's side, dad's side. And look farther back from your parents. Look at your grandparents and your great aunts and uncles. And if you know or have the ability to look at photos of your great grandparents, what is their situation? Look at siblings. And genetic hair loss can sometimes skip generations. It can skip siblings. So, we now know there's hundreds of different single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, genetically that we can look at to determine whether you're likely to have extensive hair loss due to hereditary factors, and what are the metabolic pathways that influence hair follicle metabolism, or even nutrigenomics today. Like what are you more likely to be deficient in, whether it be vitamin D or iron or minerals or protein intake or collagen production. All of these different things can be looked at from a genetic standpoint to kind of figure out what's going on. So when someone comes into the practice, a lot of our diagnosis is from this history taking, right? We've just talked about all of these different factors. So we want to try to get all that as much as we can evaluated. Let's look at what's going on in their genetic code. Let's do some biomarker testing. Let's do some lab work if necessary. But also, we want to know, what are those family history look like in terms of hair loss, and what is their own history of hair loss? Is it a sudden shedding phase, after COVID infection or the lockdown or something that we've just seen, or vaccination? Is it something where you're on a new medication like a weight loss drug, for example, which can often be associated with hair loss at the same time? And so blood pressure medications.
But like literally, why do people lose hair sometimes? What's happening at the follicle level cause them to lose hair, and why do they seem to grow hair in other places they don't want? Like, it seems like hair, the cellular signaling stops in one place and starts in another.
Well, that's a good point. So let's just think about how hormones affect hair for a moment. Of course, as men go through puberty, we start to grow hair in places we didn't have, right? So whether it's below the belt or, under the chin, under our nose, we start to grow hair, and that's from the male hormone increase that happens around the time of puberty. And so, but we also know that male pattern hair loss is due to a trigger that is derived from male hormones. So the master male hormone is testosterone. It's broken down into DHT, dihydrotestosterone, occurs in the body, and it's actually the DHT which causes male pattern hair loss. So what's happening at the level of the follicle is that certain hair follicles, like I said, the ones that you see appear, quote unquote, after puberty, or basically, mature, which are pubic hair, beard, facial hair, and all of that, that is going to be stimulated by certain hormones. And then other hormones, like male hormones, are going to affect the hair follicles on the scalp in the opposite fashion. They're going to cause that miniaturization or weakness. So if we just look at androgens as a general category of hormones, we know that androgens have two different effects depending on where your hair follicles live in your body. After puberty, you're going to have more hair on the rest of your body and less hair on your scalp over time. And, even as guys like us, we get older, we can see more hair growing out of our ears and crazy hairs growing out of our eyebrows or our nose. And certainly that happens increasingly with age, of course.
Okay. So what's like the average situation of a person that comes to you? Like, how old? More men than women, or it's equal?
Well, see here in the practice, so I've been in practice almost 28, almost 29 years, and I've treated over 34,000 patients. So I have seen it all. And there are patients that come in who are of young age that have had traumatic hair injuries or scalp injuries due to an accident, whether it be a dog bite or other trauma, car accident, a burn or a fire. And so, in those cases, we're talking about scarring alopecia. And so that anybody can be affected by that, right, if they have an injury. Women who have had cosmetic surgery can have scarring alopecia where the incisions were made for their facelift or brow lift. But most of our patients, I would say, are coming in today at a much younger age than they were previously. And even though I see patients from, let's call it 18 to 88 in general, when it comes to male pattern hair loss, that's going to skew mostly in the 25 to 35 or 45 range. Oftentimes around midlife, men kind of wake up and they're like, oh my gosh, I'm getting older. I need to fix myself, fix my hair, get my gym membership going, trade in my old car. Those are oftentimes where we see change of life. And so that's often a trigger. But as I mentioned earlier in our discussion, sometimes it's those guys in their early 20s who are affected most detrimentally, mentally from their hair loss situation, and they're in a dire state of emergency when it comes to seeing their hair loss occur. And so for women, as I mentioned, you could see different peaks in the life cycle of women. So for example, in the women of childbearing age, if they're afflicted by polycystic ovarian syndrome, for example, PCOS, that happens. That's actually the most common hormone abnormality, women of childbearing age. That's often associated with hair loss, as well as weight gain, acne, oily skin and scalp, whole body inflammation, and things such as that. And that has to do with an androgen sensitivity. So, dialing back to those androgens again. Women often see hair loss after childbirth. So very oftentimes we see hair loss occur after childbirth, maybe about a month or so later. There's an excessive shedding. Now, usually that grows back after some time, but sometimes it just accelerates the natural female pattern of hair loss. And of course, during menopause, women will come in. Oftentimes they're seeing a change in their color of their hair, their texture of their hair, the overall volume and length of their hair is changing over time. So really throughout our entire lives, hair can be an issue. And I meet every patient, wherever they are in their hair loss and hair restoration journey. Probably the average age of hair transplantation is going to be, in the mid to high 30s in terms of their years. But again, we have patients who are much younger who need hair transplantation to effectively change their goal. But of course, we would never transplant, or to reach the goal, I should say, but we would never transplant a patient in the younger ages unless they're stabilized on hair loss. And so that's a big part of what we do in the practice is evaluate, measure, benchmark their hair situation, get them on some kind of medical therapies first.
What would happen if you did do a hair transplant of someone that was younger and, existing hair tried to grow in under or above the new hair, the transplanted hair?
Well, the most common issue with applying a treatment such as hair transplants in a person who is not on treatments to stop the progression of hair loss would be that the fact that the transplants are permanent. When we harvest hair follicles today from the sides and the back of the scalp, and even though we're doing it today a lot less invasively, completely painlessly, we're taking the individual groups of hair follicles one at a time. There's no scalpel or stitches or linear scar left behind. We're doing that methodology of transplantation that's minimally invasive, and we're recreating a beautiful new hairline and maybe even filling in the density as we go further back wherever we can. Those follicles are permanent, so they last forever, but it's your other hair that's not. So you've got to be on some kind of medical therapy to hold on to the rest of the hair. Otherwise, you're going to be needing a repeat transplant pretty quickly. And unfortunately, this is, we're seeing this more often today because, hair transplant surgeons either don't have the time or the impetus, let's say, to talk to their patients about prevention. And we're seeing a lot of younger patients go under the knife or traveling to foreign countries where they're not getting good guidance on how to take care of their hair, their non-transplanted hair. And, a lot of these folks are becoming walking wounded. They're running out of their own donor hair, actually. And it's a big problem.
Well, what happens when you do a transplant? Like, what are you doing for someone that, I don't know. How does it work?
Yeah, hair transplant surgery is a very cool procedure. We're basically taking the follicles almost individually or as small groupings of 1, 2, or 3 hair follicles, one at a time, from the back of the scalp where the hairs are immune and permanent. They live and grow there forever. They're essentially almost immortal. Those follicles are harvested from the back of the scalp and then implanted into the thinning or the balding area. Now, we have to do it not only with great surgical skill, microsurgical magnification, good lighting, but we also have to apply artistry. So the design of the hairline, the angle, the orientation, the position of the hairs are critical in order to get a result that looks normal and natural and not like a picket fence. And so there's a really interesting blend of technology and artistry that's used to create the final result. The procedure is done under local anesthetic. It's not a fast procedure. It does take many hours. Sometimes it takes more than one day to accomplish the results that we try to achieve. But the patient will be experiencing no discomfort during the procedure. Their scalp is totally numb. And usually at night after the process, if they have a minor headache, it's easily handled by an over-the-counter pain medication like, Tylenol, Advil, that type. And then the crusting.
Are you like stitching the hairs in like a cross stitch in a rug? What are you doing?
Yeah, no. When we say something is microsurgical, we're talking about harvesting follicular unit grafts that are literally smaller or less, have a smaller diameter than the tip of a ballpoint pen. A tip of a ballpoint pen is about 1 millimeter in diameter. And so our instruments are about that same size or smaller. And what we're doing is we're creating a scoring incision around the follicle, and then the follicle is then plucked. The follicle has a depth of about, let's call it 4 to 5 millimeters below the skin. And so that graft is then plucked from the back of the scalp, and then it's stored literally in a storage solution, which is very highly specific for hair transplantation, that enables us to keep those follicles alive outside the body for a number of hours while awaiting implantation. And then those follicles are then implanted into the thinning or the balding area, according to our design work, obviously. And that has to heal. Those follicles will then heal in position in their new location. New blood flow will be developed into that area, attached to those hair follicles. And the follicle will heal. There's a little scabbing, crusting that goes on for the first, so let's call it 6 to 8 days or so. Crusts flake off. The little tiny stubble of hair is shed. And then a new hair shaft is produced by that follicle, starting about 4 to 6 months later, depending on, some of the intricacies of the procedure. So about 6 months after the procedure, you have about 50% of the growth coming in, and then it continues to improve, more density, more length, more quality and caliber of hair up to about a year. And then you'll see the full final result at that time.
Oh, wow. So it really takes a year for everything to come back.
Yeah, it takes a good 6 months to kind of get an idea of how it's growing. That's about the halfway point, but it really takes a full year to appreciate the full final result. And now, honestly, depending on the severity of hair loss, we might need to do more than one session.
You talked about DHT. For the men, maybe even the women. The women only need a tiny bit, but do you also check the men's testosterone level and supplement with that to encourage hair growth?
Well, of course, if blood work is needed, we will do it. In men, it's not so important to check their testosterone levels as it is to keep an eye on DHT, right? So dihydrotestosterone, the DHT, is something that we may monitor depending on what kind of medications we have those patients on. Again, that's something that is really, really important and customized to each and every patient. It's not a cookbook, one size fits all. But certainly, if we're trying to use some of the more nuanced medications that have a little bit more power, a little bit more strength, maybe have a little bit more risk, then certainly we want to be tracking those really critical biomarkers to see how things are going. But even more important than that, we want to be measuring how the effects are occurring on the scalp, right? The scalp and hair density. We want to look at the numbers of hairs and the quality of those hairs over time.
How many hairs are needed per square centimeter in order for it to look like someone has a full head of hair? And is there a big range on that?
Yeah, actually, there is quite a big range. So here's the thing about hair, right? Hair varies in terms of caliber, right? So the range of hair caliber, if you're on the lower end, you have thinner, finer hair to begin with, your hair caliber might be in the high 50s or low 60s. If you have thicker quality hair, coarser hair, Asian hair, for example, could be 90, even up to 100 microns thick, which is very, very different because the amount of hair follicles that you need for coverage has to do with the thickness of the hair. Think about are you growing birch trees or oak trees, right? And then the curl of the hair, right? So if the hair is exceptionally curly, you get a little bit more coverage per hair. And then the length of the hair, right? If the hair is super short, wow, you're going to need more density, meaning more numbers of hairs in the forest, so to speak, in order to cover the ground. So there's a lot of different variables. But most people want to know how much transplants are actually needed to get to their end result. And of course, that depends on the amount of hair loss that they have to start with. All of those color, quality, texture issues we just discussed, the contrast between the color of the hair and the color of the scalp can make a difference too. So let's just say you have dark hair, light skin, you need more hair to make that happen. Whereas if you have more blonde or gray versus lighter colored skin, you don't need as much hair. But most patients will need probably 1 to 2 sessions of transplants to reach their goal. That's just kind of the average. My dad needed 4. It was a more heroic restoration. Right? He needed 4 separate procedures to get to his goal. He was totally bare. We went from bare to hair a number of years
ago. So he
ago.
still has hair today?
Well, remember, the transplanted hairs are permanent. They are not going to be affected by natural male pattern hair loss. There are other things that can affect your hair. But yes, if you met my dad today, he's in his mid-80s, you're going to see that he's got a full head of hair. And you would never know that he was totally bald.
Yeah, it's very rare. Huh.
So I know that's a kind of a roundabout way to discuss it. People like to have a number. How many follicular units per square centimeter is required to get the density? Well, I want you to think about it this way. I think the more important question to ask is how much hair can you lose before it looks noticeable to the naked eye? And I think that's an important question.
Can you
actually,
over restore it where it's too thick and it looks ridiculous?
That I'm not coming to. No, I haven't seen that yet. No one's ever complained that they had too much hair. Because here's the thing. The way that hair covers the scalp, you could actually lose 50% of your density. And science has shown this in clinical trial. 50% of your density could be lost. And it still looks about the same as 100%, believe it or not. And so that means that you can lose 50% of your hair mass and it still looks okay. It still looks like you've got a decent head of hair. And so that also works in reverse. If we put back a certain percentage of hair, let's call it, 30 to 45% of your hair, then that's enough to deliver coverage. And so that's why hair transplants work, because we're not yet creating new hair follicles. We're just redistributing some from the back of the scalp. We're like borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. You know what I mean?
All right. So what else can you do besides a transplant? Let's say the person has no hair back there. They can't be a donor to themselves. What do they do now?
Well, the good news is that male pattern hair loss does not affect the hair around the sides and the back of the scalp. So the vast majority of men who have male pattern hair loss, they can be treated with hair transplantation and other therapies to protect their own living and growing hair. Sometimes patients get into trouble. They've had previous surgeries that were maybe not done so efficiently or effectively. And they end up with a lot of scar tissue in the back of their scalp from old style techniques like a strip harvest or the old plugs that we talked about earlier. They haven't been treated with this less invasive technique, and they're running low on donor hair. Well, gosh, we can't make any new hair, but we can use other sources of donor from their body. Actually, we can use body hair as well as beard. And so beard follicles are a very excellent source of donor hair if you're running low on scalp hair.
Won't it grow in crooked or curly?
Well, and I'm glad you asked that question and brought to light the fact that, yes, your beard quality is usually a little bit different than your scalp hair quality. Now, some of the good news is that the caliber of the hair is a little bit thicker, so that for hair follicle by follicle, you actually get a little bit better coverage, right? Think about that oak tree versus a birch tree. But yes, the wiriness or the curl of the hair that you get from the beard is a little bit different. And sometimes it's more gray in guys who are getting to be middle age or older than, let's say, their scalp hair. So color and quality, texture issues can be an issue. And that's one of the reasons why we have to use that kind of alternative donor hair very carefully. Maybe we wouldn't put it in the hairline, for example, or create a patch of it in the back of the crown. We would want to kind of pepper it in between some of their other hair that's available. Maybe from the scalp, for example. And the same is true in terms of different types of quality of hair if we go to the body hair. So you may have a gentleman who's got exceptionally high density of chest hair, belly hair, or even arms and legs, but those hairs grow much more slowly, and they actually spend more time resting and not growing. And they have a maximum length that may be very short compared to like what you would get from the beard or the scalp. So those are important considerations, if we have to, abandon the scalp and go someplace else to go get hair, because we don't have hair follicle cloning yet. Although, there is some cool technology on the stem cell therapy side that's coming our way.
What about the ethnicity of the person?